If you want to make things that make things better, have fun doing it, and learn to help yourself and everyone around you flourish, well, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Enliven. This is the show where we explore what's possible and the people, the principles, and the practices that are going to help you build enlivening products and enlivening organizations. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and in this episode, my guest is Barry O'Reilly. Barry and I cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and it is not one to miss. Now, before I get into what we cover in this episode, first, let me tell you a bit about who Barry is. Barry O'Reilly is a business advisor, entrepreneur, and author who works to help people invent their future instead of fearing it. Barry has pioneered the intersection of business model innovation, product development, and cultural transformation to help leaders and their organizations innovate at scale. Barry is the founder of Exec Camp, where he helps turn executives into entrepreneurs. He's worked with leading organizations from all over the globe, including ThoughtWorks, the World Health Organization, and the leadership teams of many of the Fortune 500. Barry has published 2 books, Unlearn and Lean Enterprise. He currently serves on the faculty of Singularity University and is a frequent contributor to The Economist, Harvard Business Review, MIT Sloan Management Review, among many other publications. Now, we start by dropping right into a powerful moment in Barry's career as a young entrepreneur. We go on to cover everything from deliberate practice to cultural change within an organization to how thinking we're right gets in the way of our own growth and what we can actually do about that. I will actually be your guinea pig for Barry to live demonstrate some of his unlearning techniques. That's right. He actually puts me in the hot seat for a minute there, and it's pretty interesting. Now, it's my pleasure to welcome him to the show. So without any further ado, please enjoy this wide-ranging conversation with Barry O'Reilly. Barry, we're already going, but officially, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Here, look, it's a pleasure to chat with you. I'm very interested in work you're doing. Happy to share some of the stuff I'm doing and see where it goes.
Absolutely. So as we were chatting kind of before we started recording, I love to start kind of more on the personal side. And one of the things that I noticed when I was digging around, getting ready for this conversation, there was a blog post from a couple of years ago that I really loved of yours. And I just had this picture, and I was hoping you could sort of start there and paint the picture for us, and just we'll see where it goes from there. But it sounds like you, at the end of your first year as an entrepreneur, were sitting in this beautiful rock garden in Kyoto, having some pretty profound realizations about sort of the nature of entrepreneurship and what it's really like. And could you tell us that story?
Yes, a pretty fun story, actually, or definitely an experience for me. Yeah, so after I started my sort of company as I'm working on at the moment, we took sort of, we basically had 4 weeks to go to Japan. I was going out there to do a workshop in Tokyo based on Lean Enterprise, which is a fun experience to go to Japan and teach people about Lean. Was sort of odd, but very, very humbling sort of experience. And on the back of that, me and my wife took 3 weeks to travel all around the country. And Kyoto is obviously a must stop for anybody who's going to Japan. And there's this really famous sort of Zen garden there, where there are 17 stones in this Zen garden, but it's never possible to see them all. No matter what angle that you move around this garden, you're only able to see at most 16 stones because of the way they're laid out. So it's one of these like interesting conundrums, and a lot of people go there sort of to, reflect on, where they're at. And, the timely point for me was that I was a sort of year into starting the business for myself. And it had been tough. Like I'd moved to America to start the business with two other people. And, at 6 weeks in, it became pretty obvious that we all had different assumptions about what the company was going to be about. And, I'd quit my job, moved to America, full of hope and dreams. I'm going to land here. It's going to be great. I'm working with 2 people I admire. They're brilliant.
This is like the American dream. Is the movie right here. You
know it, right? And 6 weeks in, we all are just looking at each other going, this is not what we want to do.
What happened?
So it was tough, and so I literally got into the minus points in terms of my hopes and dreams on the back of that, and really had to sort of claw my way out of figuring out like what did I really want to get out of starting this company as we had started it, and what did I want it sort of to become afterwards. And you're full of feelings of regret and anger, and you're fed up at the other people that they let you down, or were you stupid to do what you did, or I had to work through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah.
And this was just sort of one of these funny, poignant moments, and I'm sitting there going, why can't I see 17 rocks? Like, there must be a way to do it.
You're trying to solve the riddle.
You know it, and it just, there's such a parody there, I think, with any entrepreneurship activity where it's embracing uncertainty as a lifestyle is how I sort of feel about starting any business. And many of the things you believe will be true are always turn out not to be the case. And it's tough sometimes, but it's also super rewarding in other times. And, like that was sort of the real inspiration for me, just really a chance to sort of capture some of my lessons learned with that blog. And it's so funny you mentioned that, like, it's one of those blogs I think I wrote that more people reached out to me on the back of it to say, God, I've been 0.4 and 0.7, man, that's my life right now, or I'm just connecting with people, I think, who have realized that entrepreneurship is not necessarily hey, I woke up one morning, went for a jog, and when I got back by lunchtime, I built this amazing app, and now we're a massive unicorn, and everything's going perfect. And I think it just encapsulated the grind that is associated with continuously trying things to find out what works and what doesn't. And same with the company, starting it, like we all believed we had the same idea, but until you actually start road testing stuff, you never really find out, and sometimes what you find out is not what you hope. But again, if you can adapt to that, if you can find ways to sort of recognize that, failing sucks, but you can sort of work your way through the ashes and learn a little bit about yourself and recalibrate and go from there. And I think that was sort of that was how I started this company, literally from the ashes of like getting to ashes very quickly, which was kind of sad in itself, but
Wow. So what happened then?
Well, I sort of was left with this dilemma of, what do I really want to do? And at the time, my wife works for the World Health Organization. So she actually does like good things in the world, like she was part of the Ebola and Zika virus response team. She works in the World Health Organization. And, she was still based in Geneva on the back end of the pandemic response to the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone. And I'd come over to America to start this company. So we were already like going back and forth between Europe, and I was sort of like trying to figure out, like, what do I really want to do? And do we really want to make this, shot of it here in the US for a while? So, I did what I often do when I'm stuck in these uncertain moments. I started describing to myself, well, what is my vision here? What is success for me? If I was going to try and build this sort of, like a consulting advisory business, like what would that look like? And I started to map out in 2 years what I would be doing, and then just work backwards from there. It's like in 2 years, a year, 3 months, what would I have to be doing in 3 months to sort of find that out? And funnily, I sat down and had this conversation with my wife, and she's like, okay, well, let's see the KPIs. Let's come up how will you know that this business is working in 3 months' time? And I described the outcomes over those different time horizons of 2 years, a year, 6 months, 3 months. And that was it. And then I was like, let's give it a go, and that set up my own sort of next round of experimentation, really, as I knew roughly where I wanted to take the business, and set some outcomes and started coming up with some experiments to give it a go. And yeah, it was pretty fun. I am an experimenter. I think anyone knows me. I advocate through either lean software development or product development. I sort of like live it as a lifestyle. It's not like I'm one of those people who I don't think I'm like a Tim Ferriss type weighing out 4.5 grams of protein with every meal. I don't think I'm that level, but I am deliberate and intentional. And I know when I'm in uncertainty, I've got to have a system in place to help me make some good decisions along the way. And, using that philosophy on myself helped me to sort of like figure out what I wanted this business to be and then know if it's actually moving in the direction I wanted. And, I was new to the US. It was my two founders were much more established in the US. They had a network. They had, people to pull on, where for me, I had to sort of start from scratch. And, so like, success was like going from 0 to 1, from one to 3, from 3 to 5. And, and I think it's one of those odd things about a business is you have to be patient, but you also need urgency to keep pushing. And I was lucky enough. Like I found one or two clients who had read Lean Enterprise and were curious to try and apply it in their company, and that got me started. And we just sort of started to build from there. And 3 months in, I hit my KPIs, and we sort of, had the conversation with my wife about, she got offered another great opportunity to keep working on the Ebola project. So she's like, well, let's do 6 more months where, she was still working from Switzerland and I was in the US, and, we'd go back and forth. And, and just over time, we've just sort of built it up bit by bit, podcast by podcast, meet more people around the world like yourself. And, it's been a lot of fun. And
what I so love about that story is kind of exactly what you touched on. Like you and I are still just getting to know each other, and right away I could it was super clear that you are like, you don't just talk about experimentation. Like this is like your life, right? So it's like when you come into a company, you're not just like spouting off these ideas that you've never tried. You're like, no, I put my family through this. Like, you're like, believe me, when I say this has been battle tested, like I'm talking like the kitchen table, come to Jesus talk with my wife. Like we have tried this stuff. So I just think that's amazing, because not only does it give you, I think, a deep level of intimacy with the material you're teaching people, but also like there's some legit credibility there. So one of the things I'm really so curious about, like you talked about uncertainty as a lifestyle, right? And going back to the joke, right, about like, oh yeah, I went for a walk, had a ham sandwich, and now I've got a unicorn startup, right? It's like that's how it works, right? That's what Silicon Valley, the TV show, shows me. But I think you're really hitting on something with that idea, right? Of when I think about all the significant projects I've ever worked on, or anyone I know has worked on, or anybody who where I actually have gotten to know the person beyond like the press release or the Twitter bio or whatever, there's always this enormous amount of uncertainty, on personal levels within the project itself. And, one of the jokes I like to make with some of the engineers I work with is like, anyone who's ever built and shipped a product, like you ask the customer who's happy with the product, they love it. You ask the person who worked on it, and they're just intimately familiar with like all of the flaws, all of the hidden ugly stuff that they're just like, oh, don't even get me started on that thing. Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm just so curious about, like, when you think about how do you, I mean, obviously experimentation is a major theme in your life. But when you think about it, like zooming out from just the tactics of business, right? But you think about uncertainty as a lifestyle. How do you think people should approach that? Like, how do you approach navigating that uncertainty?
Yeah. I often have this mantra of like thinking big and starting small. I think I say that quite a lot. And, and I like just other simple examples from my life, when I finished, I love travel, right? I grew up in a small town, tiny little fishing village, 5,000 people in Ireland, it's still there. 90% of the people are still there, right? It's, and, I always knew I wanted to sort of travel and see the world and get it. And, that was just my thing. And like the way I would always try and like have this aspiration, but I'd always do something like really, really small to start. And so, for instance, when I finished university, I literally was like, I'm going to backpack around South America and just go for 6 months and see what happens. Couldn't speak a word of Spanish, travel on my own. Yeah. And, and for so many people, they were like, that's crazy. What, and this is like just at the start of 2000s, so there wasn't even, and for me though, it was like, that's what I want to do. So how would I prepare myself to do that? So I used to do like little things, like I booked a ticket to just get a train from like London to Amsterdam on my own for like 3 days to find out like, what would it be like to just travel on my own for a little bit of while, right? So it's only 3 days. Like what could possibly go wrong?
Sure.
And doing these small little tests almost, right? If I'm going to disappear on my own for 6 months or a year, just travel on my own, like nobody to talk to. What's like people, get nervous about that. And I was like, well, I just did it for 3 days and I survived. Can I do it for a week? I do it for a month, and so a lot of that sort of pattern of like, I have these, I do think like, yeah, go travel on my own for a year. Let's go do it. But then I might start small with like a 3-day trip and see how I get on. And that pattern is sort of ingrained in me in so many things that I do, right? Start a business. Yeah, right. Well, what's the smallest thing I could do tomorrow to start finding out if that's going to work for me or not, or how I might experience that. And I think, I think that's the uncertainty as a lifestyle type thing, right? I'm always the person where people are like, hey, let's go to this festival, or hey, let's go to this thing. And, I don't always go, yeah, great, I want to go. But I'm curious enough to like find out like, well, how can I find out quickly if that's something I would be into or not? And rather than sort of get hung up with the, no, I don't like that, or no, I wouldn't do that, I'm much more of the mindset of, well, how can I try something quickly to see if I like that? Would I like that sport? Would I like that type of food? Would I like that type of product? And I think that has served me very well in terms of not only figuring out what I like, but figuring out myself. And I guess I'd encourage more people just to do that, is to think, rather than yes or no, think more like try quickly, fast and small, and figure it out.
Yeah.
That's much more my sort of approach, I guess.
Was it always like that for you, or did somebody teach you this?
I don't know. It's kind of funny. Like, it's one of these things, like when people ask you these questions and you reflect on it, you're like, well, shit, yeah, that's actually what I'm doing. And, like I was very lucky, right? Like my folks were great at encouraging me to sort of do things, right? They were sort of, give it a go type people, and it's funny, even when you think about so much of the research now from people like Carol Dweck, who wrote a fantastic book called Mindset, about a growth and fixed mindset. Like, I think my parents were practicing that without research to back them up, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and,
totally.
It's sort of like those sorts of things have been, they become very intentional to me now as well. When I'm working with people, when I'm spending time with people you're trying to help, is just encouraging them to try rather than sort of letting them believe that they're good at something or not good at something. Because it holds so many people back from doing stuff that they could be amazing at, but they'll never find out because they're like, oh, I sucked at English in school. Like, I got D pluses in English literature all through school and thought I couldn't ever write anything, and here I am down the road with 2 books because I found a different way to create content, right? You and I, because talking was a better medium for me to create content than typing.
Yeah.
So most of the content creation I do now is I talk it.
Perfect.
And I transcribe it, and suddenly I've got like 10,000 words in an hour. And most books are 70,000 words for anybody out there who's harboring ambitions to write one. So all you need is like 7 hours of talking to somebody that's somewhat relevant and record it all, and you got a book.
There's your first draft. You do that on a Saturday.
Right. So, it's just like there's so many different ways to think about how you can accomplish certain things that aren't necessarily the conventional way to do it. And, if you don't try and figure out what's your jam in terms of driving that, then you're just going to close all down these opportunities that life presents. So that's sort of more how I come at it from.
I love that. I love that. I'm not a parent yet, but I think about like, so the book you mentioned, Mindset by Carol Dweck, that and Grit by Angela Duckworth are like basically, if I could combine two books into one Bible, those are probably the two. I have them like right behind me on the bookshelf, and they are just dog-eared and tattered like nobody's business. And I remember specifically like literally begging my brother to read these books. I was like, I will buy them for you. I will read them to you. Like whatever it takes. I don't care. Right. Cause I have two little nieces that are absolutely adorable. And I was like, okay, I was thinking a lot about how do we, as the adults in the family, like how do we model for these kids, cause I mean, I'm not a parent yet, like I said, but what I have gathered from talking to lots of parents is that, it's not like you can say whatever you want, but it's really what you do that they're going to pick up on. And so it's really kind of that idea of modeling. And what I'm really curious about is like, was there any particular behaviors that you think, like when you think about like, did your dad model something for you, or now that you're a dad, how do you think about modeling these types of behaviors?
Yeah, it's everything you're saying resonates massively, right? Like I see this so much, because people do judge you on your actions, not what you say, right? And whether that's in a family context or whether you're in a company, yeah, we're an open, transparent, collaborative organization. Now sit down in your cubicle and get your work done, right? Like people see the contrary and they call it out, and you lose credibility, whether that's with your kids, your friends, or your colleagues, right? And for me, I think one of the most important roles of any leadership activity is you got to role model what you're looking for other people to do, and whether that's if you want people to try things in your company, you should be trying things. If you want to create a culture that's open and inclusive, you've got to be open and inclusive. One of my favorite stories from, I coach executive team at this massive bank, and, classic bank, very bureaucratic, hierarchical. And what I used to love is like one of the most senior execs in the whole company. What he used to do is when the grads all came in every year, he would go and like sit with them for half a day and give them all the problems that he was currently trying to solve, to see how they would solve them differently, like with new technologies or maybe new methods, because it provided him this ability to sort of like find out what were other ways that people would tackle problems he was so ingrained about how he would tackle them. And everyone would sit around the office going, what is this corner office exec doing talking to like a grad who's just started like 2 days ago? Why are they doing that?
Yeah,
they shouldn't be talking to, right?
Yeah, what?
But again, again, it's this idea of it role modeled a behavior where it doesn't matter who you are in this company, you've got something to bring to the table. And whether I'm the most senior and you're the most junior, who cares? But I could probably learn some stuff from you, and I think that's really powerful, and a lot of the great, I guess, other leaders and inspirers for me is like, that's the kind of stuff that I sort of picked up is it's really important to sort of live and honor these things if you're serious about it, because people will call you out on it if you're not. And, those are some of, I think, the great things, whether you're trying to role model good behaviors for your kids or with your friends or your colleagues. These things are sort of super powerful, I think, and really make it concrete about what you're about to people. And I think that's really important. Totally.
Yeah. The one of the things that I was like that came up a lot when I was and we'll talk a lot more about Unlearn and your new book. But one of the things that came up for me when I was reading it and listening to your podcast, which is excellent, by the way, that really started coming up as this thread was like the barriers that people stumble upon, right? And how, kind of going back to the idea of mindset, how many of those barriers like I think many people, and I'll call myself out on this as well. When I've been frustrated at times before, my first instinct, and I think it's a natural reaction, is to like look externally, right? Like, okay, there's something in my environment that's messing this up. It's like that person's fault, or it's the way the company is, or whatever. And yeah, sometimes there's an element of truth to that, but every single time if I stick with the inquiry, I very quickly find like, okay, yes, there may be something outside, but there's also some piece of this that's mine to own and I need to be responsible for. And I'm curious, like how do you, because you have seen more people go through this process than I think anybody I've personally spoken to. But what do you see people get tripped up on, and how do they get out of those gaps?
Well, look, you're touching on some of the most important ones, right? I always think the first one for me is always curiosity, right? Like, how interested are you really to like get information that's counter to what you believe? And the simplest examples of this is, say you're working with someone and you give them a task to do that you know how to solve or you've solved before. And then they start doing it in a different way. What's your reaction? What's your reaction there? Right?
So my first reaction is I almost want to like reach and stop him. Or I'm like, and then I'm like, no, stop. Let him do it. Like my instant reaction is I want to like reach out and almost protect them because I like don't want them to waste their time. But then instantly on the back of that, there's like this other, I don't know where it's coming from, but this other thing that's like, no, hang on. Let's see what happens.
Right. And it's such a classic, right? Yeah. And even when it's coming from positive intent, as you're describing there, it's very easy for us to go, oh, no, you're doing it wrong. No, you do it this way. Right. And this person could be creating an innovation and you're just like chopping it off.
I'm just cutting them off at the knees.
Right. Or you're removing all this sort of expression from them, and so, that's a classic one. The ownership piece you mentioned is, I think, probably the next most critical, if not the most critical in some respects, because ultimately when we're not getting the results we want, who do we point that to? Do we blame someone didn't do what they were going to do? This other team is letting us down. It's my manager's fault, or, and it's a very human reaction. But like ultimately, the only people we can really change is ourselves. And the only way we can really have any agency is by doing things differently ourselves. And I think starting with that is so important, is if you can really own the results, just like when I started the company with two other people, it'd be easy to blame them and go, oh, it's their fault that it didn't work out, but what I also found is when I sort of owned it, we said, right, well, this hasn't worked out. I'm part of that. Made the things I believed were not true. So now what am I going to do differently as a result of that? And that just unlocks a whole different sense of accountability and ownership about how you can work your way out of these things. And I think if you're not someone who's willing to do that, I think you're going to really struggle to both really learn and unlearn things that are not working for you, and then there's so many other things like our natural biases. Our biases exist to help us make decisions quicker. They're helpful. They also hinder us, being aware of some of those things. Our desire to always be correct, our dopamine hits of that great feel.
That's my favorite. Doesn't it just feel so good to be right? It feels so good.
Go on, hit me again.
Yeah.
Like, it's like so, and it's like these things are, they're within us, and then we have externalities like maybe the incentive structures in the companies that we operate within, the leadership conditioning of the places we're in. Great leaders tell people what to do, so I'm going to tell everybody what to do.
Yeah.
So it's sort of hard to just essentially be aware of these things and, not to go down the rabbit hole on them all, but just sort of be aware of these things. And if you can ask yourself tougher personal reflection questions, I think that's where you get a lot of benefit. And what I've noticed with the true, like, outstanding performers I've got to work with, reflection is part of their habit, whether it's daily reflection or weekly reflection, or like they make time for it. They're not just doing stuff all the time. Like they make time for it. And probably the classic example of this is there's a great story of when Bill Gates met Warren Buffett for one of the first times,
Mm-hmm.
and Gates is like phenomenally known for like managing his time down to like the 5 seconds in his calendar, and he if you ever looked at his calendar, it was like all these very micro meetings and everything's just like jammed in. And then when he met Warren Buffett and looked at his calendar, there's like 2 meetings in it for the whole week. And he's like, what the hell's going on? And Warren's like, well, look, these 2 things are really important. And the rest of the time, I need to be thinking about stuff. And if something important comes up, I'll put it on my calendar. But I'm going to make time for thinking. And it's such this like different juxtapose of these massively successful people, but it's just always interesting to sort of like compare and contrast those methods a little bit.
I wonder if is that the source of I think they later became famous, but I always heard the story that Bill Gates had his like famous think weeks where he would just go off the grid for like I think it was a week, a quarter, which is a lot. I mean, for a CEO of Microsoft, that is a lot of time off the grid. Yeah. I'm wondering if that's where that came from.
I don't know, but I could definitely see why it could, right? But I think both of us do that to a certain extent, right? Like last week I was in Glacier National Park where there is no phone reception, and I'm just like hiking around,
yep,
and looking at the world go by,
mm-hmm.
and I know coming back from that already, I'm like refreshed, I'm focused, I'm recalibrated. And that, that's part of why I do those sorts of trips, if that makes sense.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, totally.
And I try to build in prompts. Like I know I reflect better in the mornings. So I try to say every second day, I have like little 15-minute reminder for me to go reflect on some stuff, like look at what you're working on, look at some of these outcomes you're aiming for. What's working, what's not? What are the little tweaks I might need to make over the next day or two? Being aware of the big thing I'm aiming for, my little small step along the way. And it's just a good habit for me. And I think when I speak to people about it, yeah, people reflect, but I don't think it's like a deliberate reflection. I think it's sort of, I'm working in an agile team and I have a retrospective every 2 weeks. Oh yeah, I'll just rock up and start reflecting in the meeting. They don't do any beforehand.
Reflection switch on.
Yeah, right. And so I think we're so overloaded with like sensory information and stuff to do and backlogs to finish and tasks to get done, and it's very easy to feel like the adrenaline hit of like just go emptying your in tray. But I think like the power of reflecting on what's actually in that out tray and lining it up to what you're really trying to achieve and what is working and not working, like that is a skill that I think few people really deliberately focus on or try to master.
Why do you think that is? Is it just a time thing? Because it seems like one of those things that, like all good habits, right? Like we all know what we should be doing. And I think this is a common theme in a lot of your work at the organizational level, right? Like we know what we should be doing. Most people in an organization have at least some sense of like, yeah, we should be doing this, or whatever. Individually, you're like, yeah, I should be saving more in my 401k or my IRA or whatever. And yet we don't, which to me is like one of the most fascinating mysteries of life, is like humans and why we do the things or don't do the things that we do. What do you see?
I just see that it feels like the propensity is always to do more. The more you're doing, the busier you are, the more you're getting through, your high output. Like we're trained in that, like we're conditioned to do that, to do 60 hours a week, to be the last person to leave the office, to like all these, like, there's sort of there is an ego to it as well.
Sure. Yeah.
But again, the more things you have moving, the more context switching you're making, the more context switching, the quality is going down, the energies are going down. So again, counterintuitively, the way to make more progress is not to do more things, it's actually to do less things and find out if those things that you're doing are actually driving the outcomes that you want. Like really making 2 or 3 bets and exploring them well is better than making 100 bets and sort of half-assing them all, right?
Yeah.
And dealing with the switching costs of all those 100 things. So it's definitely one of these things that I try to work hard on, is like limiting the amount of things I have in progress. And you've got to find your thresholds for these things. We're all different, but I know that feeling like when I have so much stuff going on and I'm trying to spin all these plates and keep them going, and it's a rush. It feels great, but then sometimes I'm like, why the hell am I spinning all these plates? Half of the stuff I don't even care about. I don't want to do. And you've no mental cycles left to like really consider some of the stuff that you really care about and you really want to go after and do well. And I think that's always one of the things that I think I definitely observe with great people I work with, is they've great focus. They actually do less to achieve more. And it's definitely one of the things I'm always trying to practice in myself, is just not having too many different types of things in progress, because the price of context switching is so high and the quality of what you do goes down. And just being aware of that, I think, is important for people, because it builds anxiety and stress. And
Oh yeah. Are you familiar with Cal Newport's work?
No.
Oh, okay. I think you were going to love this stuff. So, I won't say he's quite on like the personal impact level for me as Carol Dweck and Angela Duckworth, but he's not far below it just in terms of foundational stuff. So this guy's name is Cal Newport. He is prolific, I think is really the only appropriate word, as both an author and a computer scientist. So he's managed to be both I think he's like a 5x author, as well as being a tenured professor at a very young age at Georgetown in computer science. And that already, like that right there, you're like, okay, how's this person doing this? And where I fell in love with his work was probably, I don't know, 6-7 years ago. He wrote a book called So Good They Can't Ignore You, which is like, if anyone is feeling lost in their career and is saying, what is my passion and where is it? I thought I misplaced it. I just had it, but I can't seem to find it anymore. Like, read that book. But his further work has gone on to explore, how to have meaningful careers doing great, important work in an age of just crazy distraction, right? So his next book was called Deep Work. How do you do hard, like important work with so much noise? And then his most recent one, which is the one that I, would definitely suggest you check out, given what you were just saying about like just how refreshed you feel after going to Glacier National Park, is all about how do we cultivate, my words, not his, how does one cultivate a sense of quiet in a noisy world that is full of like things beeping and pinging us all the time. And I can personally attest to my life getting a lot better from doing some of the digital detox. Oh, that's not the term he uses. He would hate me using that term. The digital declutter. There we go. The digital declutter that he discusses in his book. So highly recommend his stuff for anybody listening. But also, I think you would dig it too, Barry.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. No, I love recommendations, which is awesome. But it's such a challenge for us, right? And we are inundated with requests for our attention at the moment, right? In this world that we're in, both social and work wise, and people responding to like Slack messages at like 11 p.m. when they're like,
Slack.
Where does it end?
Yeah.
And these boundaries are, they're becoming almost they don't exist anymore for some situations, right? And I think that it's a hard training for people to sort of step away from what they're bombarded with, right? Because that's what is expected of people, and some people are happy with that, but you also have to recognize others aren't. And that's sort of a little bit about finding out like what's the best of you, What are the systems that you need to have in place so you bring your best every day? And, for me, it is this idea of intentional time to work, time to reflect, time to exercise, time to, where I know what makes my system run at its best.
Mm-hmm.
And understanding there's always times where you have to adapt. Cool. But I think it's more and more important, especially, if we want to do great things and achieve great things for what we're capable of for ourselves, is getting to know your system to help you be successful. I think is key for people, and that is a process of experimentation and trying things and figuring out what works for you and what doesn't. And yeah, I'm super curious to read more of his work. That's awesome. Thank you.
Absolutely, check it out. I think you'll benefit a lot from it. And I think anybody would. And as you said, like, and I think kind of, zooming it out, popping back up a level, right? Like why, if we try to put this in context, like, on one hand, I think we're articulating something a lot of people, it's kind of in the ether right now. Like a lot of people are dealing with these concerns, these experiences, these emotions. And I think if we kind of reorient that and put it in context of your work, where it's especially relevant is like, if you're distracted all the time, if you're fried all the time from, Slack messages at 11 p.m. every night, never taking a vacation, never having any space to think your own thoughts, it's impossible to learn. Like nothing of substance anyway. Like you might learn that you hate messages at 11 p.m., but like how you just don't have literally the physical cycles in your, the capacity in your brain to really go risk, and take experiments and things like that to really move the needle forward. That's where I think it comes back around to what we're talking about.
For sure. Right. And, and again, it's one of these things where I think for a long time, people used to think like, learning sort of happens where you would like take time to learn, practice what you learned, reflect on what you learned. Mm-hmm. Now go back again, take time to learn, like these sort of blocks, but, and they're like explicit start and ends, and that's not the case, right? Because you're thrown so much stuff now. Where you're on a project and you're building a product and someone's like, oh God, I got to learn about how web services work. I've never built a web service before. God, I've got to be some way educated on that. Oh, and also I've got to get this other part of the system working and make sure that we've got a good pricing model for how we're going to talk to the customers. And right, there's loads of little things that are moving, so, and the more of those that are coming at you, you are getting into this firefighting mode. Right. So I think having these sort of systems to understand that you need to make capacity and time and have thresholds for how much new you can take in and how much stuff you've got to recognize is obsolete and let go of. Right. And I think that's what came to me often with this Unlearning system was I was working with these like phenomenally competent people. Right. They're running these massive organizations. They're brilliant people. But what I found was like more of the time, not learning new stuff wasn't the hard thing for them. It was actually letting go of their existing behavior was even harder because those were the systems that had made them successful. And when they're time poor and when they've lots of stuff coming at them, how do you solve the problem? Oh, I've got this hammer. I just use the hammer for everything. Here's hammer, 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 hammer. And, it wasn't the best move in every scenario, but they had no time to even think about using any other tool or invest time to learn another tool because the one that they had used was working for them. I'm the most senior person in the company. Of course it works. It must be working. Look at all my stuff. So I think that was a real aha moment for me. And then starting to help people understand these systems to recognize, well, where are you living up to those expectations of yourself? People ask me all the time, well, how do I know I need to unlearn? And it's the thing is, it's so obvious until you're told how to do it. And then everyone's like, oh God, I should have known this, but again, people don't take time or have the time to reflect, and the simple thing is when I say to people, well, here, here's a little thought experiment for the listeners. How do you know you need to unlearn? Well, think about a challenge you're facing where you're not living up to the expectations you've set for yourself, or maybe you've set some outcomes you want to achieve and you're not. Is there a scenario or a place where you're struggling, somewhere where you're struggling to resolve a challenge that you've got, or you're actually avoiding it completely because you're just like, oh, I can't even think about dealing with that right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you've tried everything you can think of and you're still not getting the results you want. Right? Like people can answer 5 different things for each one of those questions. Right? They're all signals that your existing behavior is not driving the outcomes that you want. So you probably need to unlearn.
Mm-hmm.
And yet most of those things just feel like, keep them at the door. And I'm just going to keep doing the same stuff I've been doing always and expect a different result. And I think someone called that insanity at one point.
Indeed, it has been called that.
And so I think it's just like, once I start to introduce these ideas to people, they can see a system there and they're like, so when I'm working with people, I'm like asking them like, where do you need to unlearn? Answer these questions for me. See what you come up with. What challenges surface? And then try and prioritize one of those to say, where do you think you're going to have is really going to help you the most, and limit the amount of things you're trying to change about yourself. Just think big, but start small, and learn fast what's going to work for you. And I think that is where this sort of system becomes really powerful for people, because, if you're changing too many things, it's impossible to know what led to the result you wanted or not. So again, this idea of like doing less to achieve more, small little changes, controlled sort of sample size, or, controlled experiment to a certain extent of what you're trying to change and see what works and what doesn't, is super powerful for people. So what challenge did you come up with in your head when I was saying those things?
Yeah, I was just thinking, I was like, okay, I hope he turns this on me. I'm game. I'll play. So, all right, let's do it again. So ask me the question again.
Right. So where are you not living up to the expectations you have of yourself? Maybe not achieving some of the outcomes you're aiming for. A situation you're struggling to resolve, or somewhere you're avoiding altogether. Or maybe you've tried everything you can think of and you're still not working. Or maybe like your secret sauce has suddenly just stopped. It's not working anymore.
Can it be a historical example, or you want a current one?
I think let's go current, because that's always fun. Then we can workshop this live.
All right, we're going to workshop this live. Okay, so there is a situation that I'm dealing with in business right now where a particular partner that we're working with, everything I have tried, and I have tried everything I can think of, is not effective in getting them to operate in a way that, like, based on what I see in the people that I'm working with in this particular setting, based on everything we see, we think there's a pretty clear path forward. And I have been totally ineffective at getting the people who need to take different actions to take different actions. I think that's probably the cleanest way I could say it. Yeah. So that's the situation, is that I see like what to me is a very clear path about what we need to do, that I believe, I can't promise it'll work, but I believe it's our highest odds, like our best chance path. And to me, it's extremely clear. To several other people that I have obviously been effective in convincing, it's very clear, but I have not been effective in convincing the people who actually need to take the actions along this path.
Nice. Okay, cool. Right. So there's a couple of tactics I not often try in this sort of space, right?
Okay, great.
First one, it's like, what's the real outcome you're aiming for? Like, if you totally dissolved this problem, what would be happening in like a year's time?
That is an excellent question. What would be happening in a year's time if we totally dissolve this? I think what would be happening is that the group that I'm working with on this would be totally, they be totally self-sufficient in an experimental, innovative kind of way. Like they would be thinking on their own. Like they would be thinking this way on their own without anyone needing to like, handhold them along the way. They would just be running cycles quickly, and not. They would have overcome either the external or what I believe are actually more of the internal blocks to actually being aggressively experimental. That's what I think would happen.
Great. Yeah. And if they're experimenting, like what would be some of the things they're doing?
They would be running a lot more customer tests. They would be, more customer tests. They would be putting products in front of, they would be putting unfinished products that are not like totally packaged and polished and, signed off on by every regulatory authority in front of people to actually gauge customer response. A lot of the lean startup type things that you and I both love.
Right. Great. This is brilliant, right? So what you're describing there already is like behaviors.
Yes.
Right. Like what people would be doing differently than they're doing today, running customer tests, shipping stuff more frequently, right? Like just getting stuff that wasn't perfect out in front of people.
I think the simplest way to say it is like letting go, like stop waiting for perfect and iterate your way to quote perfect. That's I think the summary.
Yeah. So you're starting to define outcomes there, right? Which are super interesting. Like, what I normally get people to do is like write that down, like write the story you just shared, like write it on a one page.
Okay.
And then go back over that story and look for like the key behaviors that are different. So you said things like testing with customers, shipping more frequently, right? They're often verbs because verbs are new behaviors. And then I normally sort of try and say to people, right, well, how much more or less would they be doing those things on a sort of ratio or rate level? Right. So, I'm going to guess at the moment that testing with customers, how frequently are they doing that?
Not very. It's very infrequent.
Okay. So you say like we would increase the rate that they test with customers by 200%.
Yeah, I would probably phrase it in like a time interval. Like they're, putting new things in front of customers, no slower than once a month.
Okay, cool. Right. So you write that. And what I would get you to then is put that down as an outcome that you're aiming for. And write that down in sort of a center of a circle. Right now, if I said to you, if you were trying to get a team to, increase the amount of customer tests they've done to like every month from, once every 3 months, right? So by 300%, what would be some of the behaviors you think could make people do that? What would encourage them to try and start testing more? What could you do?
I can't change their incentive structure, so that one's out.
Yeah.
What could I do? Oh man. All right. I'm going to out myself here. So one of the things that, and this is me reinforcing being a learner because I'm learning live right now, like out loud and giving myself like and we'll go back to that in a second.
Good, yeah.
So this is a moment, a really good learning moment for me. So one of the things I just noticed in thinking about the answer to your question was that I have allowed my frustration with these particular people to kind of color the lenses through which I view all their actions. And so I'm typically only, this is nasty. I'm only catching them doing things wrong. I'm not catching them doing things right. And so one thing I could change is to catch them doing things right and actually like encourage them, as simple as that sounds, right? But I'm like, oh man, like I just got so frustrated that I just was like, oh, and I stopped paying attention to all I started seeing was what they're doing wrong from my perspective, and not seeing any of the things that they're doing right.
Brilliant, right?
And I feel really gross saying that, but you know what? I have a commitment to myself to like own the mistake and learn from it. So there you go.
That's why I'm not worried about you, Andy. It's like, but these are the things. It's like when you start to like go through this, right? Like, yeah, I can encourage them more. I could bring customers into the office every week and just let other teams test and see them observe. I could, and what happens often is it's the obstacle that presents ourselves, right? And we just see the obstacle so much that we're like fighting this obstacle, and we forget about like what's the outcome we're actually really trying to aim for, and that's why it's trying to pull people out of the thing that's right in front of them, to sort of go look back. Well, what are you really trying to do? And listening to you, you're like, I want my teams to be experimenting. I want them to be with customers. I want them to be iterating, and then you're like, well, how do you get them to do that? Oh yeah, you sort of get them, and suddenly you've pulled yourself away from this obstacle, and you're back thinking about outcomes that you want, and it reframes your whole mind, and I think, thank you for, your honesty there and sharing that as you go through that process, and we're all guilty of this, because when you're so like in it, all you can see is the obstacles.
Yeah.
And I think pulling yourself back out to see the outcomes is this, it's very, the best method I've discovered of like reframing where you're at, and getting this, something else to try.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows if this is going to work?
Yeah, it's worth a shot.
Right. But it's a whole like different place to be in than 2 minutes ago, where we're in this, I'm sick of this scenario. I can't think of anything to solve this. And now suddenly you're like 3 or 4 new ideas to try, and I think that's just like, so I think powerful when you get into that spot.
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a real gift. I really appreciate you taking me through that.
No, like this is honestly, it's been so interesting, right? Because I am as guilty as the next person of falling into these traps, and I'd love to say I live and breathe and dog food this stuff myself every day, but I don't, and I think that's why in so much of this, it's hard to do it on your own. It's like you were asking before, like, why don't we do this stuff? We know it's the right thing to do. Why aren't we doing it? Mm-hmm. And in many reasons, we can't just do it all on our own.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, for me, like the power of reflection, the power of coaching, the power of feedback from people you trust, like these are all mechanisms to sort of break us out of that sort of execution rut in some respects.
Yeah.
And building that into your system is important. Like I have people who coach me. I have people who, when I build things, I value their feedback, because I know they'll tell me what sucks and what doesn't in a positive kind of way. There's so I have my reflection time for me to look back on what I'm doing, and is it really what I getting the results I want? And so these things are all just countermeasures to help us. And I just really encourage everyone to try and work some of those sort of tactics into their system of operation, if that makes sense, and see how it can help you.
Totally. What's coming up for me right now is one of the threads that we were talking about earlier, about like the obstacles that come up for people when they're really trying to take on this system, a system like this, which to me is really like the behaviors that embody or exemplify really like a learner mindset, right? Like when I really think about kind of what's underneath all of this, it's like a foundation of the growth mindset. It's grit, and it's being a learner, right? But it's not just like talking about being a learner. It's it's doing it. It's being a learner in practice. And I think the biggest obstacle I've seen to being a learner is something that I am very much still practicing. And I got an opportunity to practice that live with you here like 2 minutes ago is, the obstacle is being right? Like we talked earlier, it feels so good to be right, or to think that we're right. Like it just feels so fucking good. And the thing that I had this coach, this brilliant woman named Jen, and she would always just hammer me on this, right? Cause like one of my, negative patterns that I'll go to when I get pissed off at something or frustrated is, I'll get self-righteous about it. Like I think I'm right. And I'm super convinced I'm right, and I have the evidence for it, and I've like built the case, right? And I know other people do this too, but I'm just outing myself so that everyone else can, find themselves in what I'm saying here. And I'll have this whole thing, right? And at the end of the day, I'm like, well, shit. Okay, maybe let's say, and I'm like, you know what? Let's say I am right. Maybe I actually am. But then it's like, well, but what's it get me? And the answer, I have never had any answer to that question other than nothing. Like I've been right a million times and it's bought me jack. Like it never buys me anything.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a funny one, isn't it? You know? But I just think so much of that is like a doctrine that's being pushed on us. You know, like that's the narrative that people have created about what is a great leader, what is a great founder, what is a great innovator. You know, like people always drag out poor old Steve Jobs, dig him up from the grave, and
leave him alone, people.
Steve Jobs was always right. You know.
You know what? Actually, there's a story. Have you heard? I'm sorry to cut you off. You actually finish, and I'll if it's still relevant, I'll chime in.
No. Go.
So you said, you know, people always say Steve was always right. So, but have you heard what, there's a story that I can't remember if it was Andy Grove or Larry Ellison who told this story. I want to say it's Andy Grove, who is, you know, legendary, CEO of Intel and like really popularized the whole OKR system. For anyone who's not familiar with him, go check those out. They will make your life better. But the reason I thought of that was, I heard the story a little differently. It's because people will say like Steve was always right. But the story that I thought was more interesting, and more revealing of, I think, what probably actually went on, is that Steve wasn't always right, but Steve always got it right. And it's like, well, what's the difference? And it was this idea of being a learner where, from what I've read and listened to people, I never knew Steve Jobs, I never worked with him. But what I learned or what I've heard from people is that, you know, he was like strong opinions loosely held. Like he had very strong opinions, right? He was famous for those strong opinions, and he demanded of everyone around him that they challenge his opinions. Like if you saw it differently than Steve, it was like your obligation to dissent, right? And I think that's a big value in, I think it's McKinsey, the consultancy as well. They have that same idea. Like if you see it different, like you have a duty to speak up. But the weird thing about Steve was apparently you could convince him, right? Like you could argue back. And if you convinced him, he would just completely jettison his entire former beliefs and just completely flip. Like if he was like, nope, you're right, 100% switch. And within 5 minutes, you might think he was the one who had like thought of that before. And for all the things that I have read about Steve Jobs that I don't want to emulate as a leader, as a manager, etc., I think that one is absolute gold, right? Like, cause to me, like the learner mindset gets, the thing I am actively practicing is, and I'm blatantly stealing this from another reference that I'm going to totally tell you to check out. I'm blatantly stealing this from a guy named Tom Bilyeu, who runs a studio called Impact Theory, which is maybe my favorite podcast. Brilliant. Check his stuff out. I'm totally stealing this from him. But it's this idea of the learner mindset being anti-fragile. Like it's the only thing that when attacked grows stronger, because if you can get yourself into a position where every time someone shows you how you're wrong or you discover a mistake, like we just did about like this, you know, I felt gross for a second there about like the way I'd been relating to these people that I work with. But if you can train yourself to actually make that like a positive neurochemical reward,
behavior.
Like
Yeah,
then you're off to the races. Cause like, the only reason I got so excited was the split second after I went, oh, I feel really gross about this. There was a split second later, there was this reward that came in that was like, yeah, but you're being the learner right now. And that's awesome. And I felt really, really good. And I was like, holy shit, this works. Because if I could admit that out loud and feel good about it, like that, okay, then I'm pretty optimistic about what else, like where that will take me. So that was a long rant, but that's actually what, I was thinking about it. Like, I think that might be the solution to the how good it feels to be right is what if we could make it feel equally good to find out we're wrong.
Right. And discover new information. You know, I think, what's great about what you're describing is the sad part for many people is they get trapped in the, maybe it's shame of feeling that they thought they were so right and then they were wrong, that they have to fight back. So they never get the second insight that you have here of, well, hang on, I've just made a discovery. Wow, that's actually way more useful than me feeling, was I right or wrong? I've discovered something, and something that's going to help me go in a better direction. You know, like that is iteration at its heart. That's true. I describe innovation as new information that leads to better action. Right. And if you are able to like really dial into that, you're undefeatable. You literally are, because you're just a learning machine, and not getting trapped on the result, recognizing it's a process. And if you have a good process to get new information and see if you're moving in the direction you want, that's awesome. If you get trapped in the result, success or failure of the result, of the thing you did it get a positive result? That's fixed mindset. Mm-hmm. That's where and I see a lot of people get stuck in that, because they're in a team. They build a competency for being the best coder or the best product manager. And they're always right. They always get it right. And then suddenly you give them a problem they haven't used before or tried before. And then they're 100% records up. Mm-hmm. What kind of behaviors are they going to start to implement in a team, versus someone who is like, well, look, if I can build a good process to find out if I'm right, and just trust in a process that will help me figure out, like, the result just is positive, negative, but it helps me move in the direction I want, that they're totally different people. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes a while to, I think, sometimes evolve into the person who recognizes that you're going to try lots of things when you're doing wicked problems, and lots of them aren't going to work, and sometimes they are. And if you can have the humility to recognize that, I think you're in a much better place. So kudos to you. Keep it up.
Thank you. I'll do my best. One of the things I was curious about that you mentioned was, so, there's the famous, I think came from Malcolm Gladwell, the whole 10,000 hours rule, right? And
yeah, which we'll debunk in a minute. So
So I was gonna just tee that one up and ask you if you would debunk it. But in particular, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on maybe the trade-off, I'm going to use that word, between hours and iterations, and if one is more valuable than the other.
Yeah. So, the whole 10,000 hours idea. So the person we really want to listen to is a guy called Anders Ericsson. He right. So yeah. So he's really the expert here in performance. And I think Gladwell, he's a writer, so he's like, yeah, 10,000 hours to be a pilot. That sounds good. Just do the hours and then you're done. Do the training course and then you're ready to be a Scrum Master. Like
get that CSPO certification. You're off to the races.
You're ready. You can change the world now. And I think what's very interesting about Anderson, and he has this amazing, a small little example in his book, where he would invite in one of his students every week, and he was trying to teach him a system to count up to these really, really high numbers, right? So you could try and find a way that he could sort of double numbers or double primes or something, every week he'd come in and they'd practice this sort of method and the student would develop his own system, where he sort of went from being able to get to 5 consecutive to 12 to 13. And I think around 15, he sort of started maxing out. Because he was deliberately practicing this method every week. And so that was sort of interesting to Ericsson, And then what he did is he got the student to go and invite one of his buddies to come in and try and teach him his system for how he was counting up to these really high numbers. And the student explained his system to the other student, who was sort of okay, that's kind of interesting. But he sort of started using his own system that built on top of the previous student's system. And he was able to exponentially count to way, way more higher numbers, because he was sort of taking someone's idea and building upon it again and again and again, right? So this whole idea of who was smarter, both of them had the exact same IQ, same intelligence, same everything. They're both great students. But the idea is that they were deliberately practicing different techniques to try and drive certain types of outcomes. And you see it when people are practicing instruments. Mm-hmm. You need to start small with things, very simple routines. Trying to play the guitar, you learn chords. Then once you know chords, you can start to do multiple chords. once you know chord, you can start to go up and down different fretboards, right? Like but the problem is you have to keep taking on more and more difficult challenges to stretch your knowledge thresholds, to encourage you to keep reinventing the systems that you're using to get better at things. So as the first student just created a simple system to count up to 13 consecutive prime numbers or whatever, the next student then took that and built on top of it so they could go up to like 52. The next person will take what their system and build on top of it to go to higher and higher levels of performance. And what most of us end up doing is we get a problem, we solve it in one way, and then we stick with that system for the rest of our lives. So we cap our ability, and then we don't take on more challenging problems because we're sort of afraid in some respects, or we feel like we've already figured it out. And it's one of these reasons why I'm a big advocate of growth. Means always trying to do new things all the time, because it exercises these muscles of learning, of trying things and not working, of pushing yourself to find like new edges of what your capabilities are and what you're trying to achieve. And for me, like that's mastery, and that's a sort of deliberate practice that I have, is continually finding the edge of my comfort zone, getting a little uncomfortable and seeing what kind of stuff I can create as a result of taking on more and more challenging tasks. And 10,000 hours, like doing something for a period of time doesn't make you a master. It's like actually practicing more and more difficult tasks to try and find new systems to get to higher levels of performance is actually what gets you there.
Yeah. No, I love everything you just said, and I think it's one of the areas you and I really resonate on, because just listening to you, I'm sitting here in my head going, yes, because I just love anything that helps people develop and express who they are, right? Because I believe human potential is nearly limitless, and I just love I love in whatever domain it is, whether it's at work, at home, in sport, whatever, like that to me is such a beautiful part of the human experience, is like that discovery and exploration of our own potential. Like, how far can we take this thing? Like, I don't know, but guys like Anders Ericsson, I think have really done seminal work in showing us what the path of mastery looks like. One of the things I'm really curious if you have any insights on this. So I'm also a huge fan of Ericsson's work and the entire sort of that whole field of deliberate practice. One of the things that I've beat my head against the wall on a little bit, I'm curious what your thoughts are here. If my memory on this is correct, and I totally might be screwing it up, but I think in his book Peak, Anders Ericsson sort of broke out a couple, like almost like levels of practice. And the first was, maybe they called it like naive practice or simple practice, something like that. Right. And that's just sort of like, yeah, I'm just repeating the thing and whatever. I'm just doing the same thing over and over. And then the next level was, I think they called it purposeful practice, where it's like you're describing where, you really are pushing your edge, whatever that edge is, you're pushing it. And then they talked about, the idea of deliberate practice being this true gold standard, where not only are you doing that, but you also have really tight feedback mechanisms, like with a coach. And typically it's in a domain where like excellent performance is well understood, like, sports or music, right? Like people have been doing that for a very long time. And what I found myself wondering about was like, okay, so then where does, if we try to bring this into, like day-to-day life of somebody's career, how does someone actually go about doing this and working this into their like life as, let's say, a product manager, right? Where it isn't as well defined as like what virtuoso violin playing looks like. How do you think about translating these ideas into like the day-to-day work life for people? You can take product manager as an example.
Well, it's funny, if I bring it back to the blog post that you mentioned at the start, I wrote like a retrospective on entrepreneurship, right? Like one of the points that is important for me, and there's a couple of them, it was like, find a mentor, or even better, find a few, because so much of the stuff that we're doing, especially product management, it's an emergent field, right? It's still early days for a lot of this stuff. And nobody has it figured out. And what's also sometimes more inspiring for me is like, what are people in other fields done that are similar to this, and what kind of understanding have they got about how to solve it?
Yeah.
Like, and looking for these people. Like, simple example, even with product management at the moment, like one of the big issues we have in product management is that we're building these systems that are so complicated, we're not even sure how they work or how people will use them.
Yeah.
Like, and simple examples like Facebook's hacking is such a simple example of that, right? Like, people are generally trying to build a feed, and the next thing you know, it's being hacked by bots to manipulate people's perspective of what they're watching. No product manager built a system to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's just people are using their product in unintended ways, right? And that's a safety issue, and then for me, I started to dig around and I found out that there's this whole field called resilience systems engineering, which is like based on people trying to solve these like ridiculously wicked problems. Like, how do you make a nuclear power plant safe when you've so many just moving parts about it? And they had these problems in aviation about how do you make planes safe for people to fly in them, that they, so it sort of had me digging around, and I found out all these like people who are working in like safety fields, like, and that opened up a whole new group of people that I didn't even know existed before. People like Sidney Decker and Eric Holroom and David Woods, or these characters who've been like working with NASA when they're like in the space station, and they're trying to figure out like why astronauts are doing spacewalks and potentially killing themselves because they're not sharing all the information that's happening inside the space station because they want to run their missions. Like, there's just this wealth of stuff going on out there.
Yeah. Wow.
That I'm like, there's something to learn here in my world based on these people trying to create safe systems in high stress, high expectation, high tempo environments. And I just want to go find these people and hang out with them, right? And that's a mechanism. Coaching is a mechanism. Feedback from customers, from people you trust, that's a mechanism. Like, you've got to build those into your system, right? And again, for me, like other things, like finding a trusted group of people I can collaborate and share my insecurities with, my fears, my challenges, my, all these sorts of things is like building this sort of system around me to help me be successful. And I think you need to be intentional about that, and because nobody can do this stuff on their own. I think that's the biggest fallacy of all. And recognizing that if you can build these sort of countermeasures in, it's funny. I had Gibson Biddle on the podcast before. He's the VP of product for Netflix.
Yeah, it's a great episode.
He describes this having like his own personal board of directors. Where he like brings people onto his board that he's like, all right, I'm trying to learn how to do public speaking. This person's great at that. You're going to be the director of public speaking. It's like, sounds like 1984 already. You're going to be the head of communications. You're going to be the head of, but like, that's the self-awareness in yourself about knowing where you got gaps, who can fill them, who can mentor you, who can coach you, who can be a collaborator, who can be, and I think when you're like that deliberate and systematic about these things, that's what's helped me sort of pull through. And, I live and breathe those things, and I definitely would encourage other people to be thinking about it.
Have you gone through that process yourself of like creating a personal board?
Oh yeah. Like it's huge for me, and like, that's how, like I said, I have two coaches. Who the hell is two coaches? Me. You're right. Because, one of them is very focused on specific aspects of myself. Like, how do I feel? How am I spending my intentional time? I've got a business coach, someone who's coaching me about how to like run and operate a business better, right? Like I am the most uninterested person in business operations that you will ever meet. Like, expense reports, couldn't give it. This is like the end of my life. Not interested. But you got to do it when you're running your own business, right? And So I have people coaching me on how to do that, and then myself, like running myself well, people coaching me on how to do that, trying to learn new technologies. I've great mentors around me, like people, Adrian Cockcroft, who is like VP for AWS open source. And he's just been like, he just gives me like 2 nuggets of wisdom anytime I see him. And he encourages me, Dr. Ed Hoffman, who was at NASA, I was sitting there going, oh God, maybe I've maxed out. Maybe this is as good as it's going to be. And he turns around to me when I spent time with him a few weeks ago, and he's like, I can't wait to see what you do over the next 30 years. And I was like, I hadn't even thought of that. I was sitting there, like sitting in my head going, this is it. It's never going to get, maybe I've maxed out.
I've topped out.
And it's just like, just as a quiet, like one sentence like that just sort of gives me this whole like re-energizing about myself, because they're people you admire, and it gives you perspective, and so I think just having these people around you and deliberately like digging them up and recognizing where you need it is super powerful, and I think it's a good exercise for us all to do. It's like nobody is great at everything, and a very simple small system I think that might help people. There's a book called The E-Myth. It's the Entrepreneurial Myth, and it's a really, really old book. And it's got this like really like super simple system. And all it is like it just gets you to like think about your business, and it's like a classic sort of like a wheel type scenario. There's 7 or 8 different facets to it or whatever. And you just sort of go around this wheel and you score yourself on a scale of 0 to 10. Like, how good am I at business operations? How good am I at marketing? How good am I at sales? How good am I at product delivery? Whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. It's a very simple system, but like the insight that you glean from it is super powerful, because you're like, you look, no one's 10 across the board. If they are, they're lying to themselves. But then it makes visible to yourself, like, okay, actually, for me, I really sucked at, business operations. So I need to get some help with that, because I don't want to do it. It takes energy away from me. So I'm going to get someone to help me with that or coach me with that. I like the delivery part of my job, so I'm cool there. But the marketing stuff, maybe I'm not so good at. Maybe I'll get some help there. And all these things is just raising your self-awareness and finding where you can get support and trying to build the best possible team of people around you to help you achieve, whatever mission you're going after. Yeah. And that's true of whether you're starting your own business, where you're leading a team, and what do you care about what you're trying to do with your life? So that'd be definitely a little tip I'd give people to think about.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love the theme that all just sort of fell under this really beautiful umbrella you created. Like, if nobody can do it alone, right? And I actually want to explore a little bit there. And I know we're running a bit short on time, but one of the things that I really am curious to hear about is, I know you have done a lot of work with organizations doing what I'm just going to refer to as sort of cultural transformation, right? Within an organization. Sure. And to me, like, I have dipped my toes in that water and found it to be very cold water. Like, I have found that to be, from the limited efforts I've put in, one of the hardest, maybe the hardest problem in business is, how do you change culture, right? And how do you shift culture around? And when I'm listening to you talk about this, right, I'm so fascinated by it, because my twin fascinations, professionally speaking, are product development and work design. Those are the two labels I use, right? Like, how do we, and that's really the genesis of this entire podcast, is how do we develop amazing products and amazing environments for the people who make those products, so that everybody who comes into contact with that environment and that product is better off for the contact. Like, that was the genesis of kind of everything I'm exploring. And that's the overarching question that this podcast is exploring. And we've talked a lot about products. We've talked about learning. We've talked about that, but I want to spend a little bit of time on that culture bit, because, especially, riffing on the idea of like deliberate practice and how you have to really, as you said, you have to systematize it. You have to weave it into your sort of your daily rhythms. And I think that work is such a beautiful untapped opportunity for that, for personal growth for people, because we spend half our waking hours at work, at least in the United States.
Yeah, probably more.
Probably more, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, shit, if you're going to be there all the time, like, let's get the full spectrum of what's available there. And so I guess my question, to try and turn it into a question instead of just a ramble, is when you think about like cultural transformations, I almost don't even know where to start. I'm hoping you do, but like when you think about that, of how do you if someone's listening to this and they really love these ideas, right? And they want to weave these into their daily, let's say their daily work life. And let's say that that's not the way the culture is right now. How should someone start? Like, starting small, going there, because obviously you can't change everything at once, but like, how would you advise that to start?
Yeah. And you're sort of hitting the nail on the head in different ways, right? Culture transformation is big, amorphous. It's everything and it's nothing.
Perfect.
And
sounds like a perfect problem.
It is a perfect problem, and so it's overwhelming to think about how do you do culture transformation. But it sort of goes back to this point that we talked a lot, even at the very start, is the thing that you can control in that big system is yourself. You have agency in that system to start trying to change yourself, to role model the behaviors that you're looking for other people to create in the company. And what you're hoping for is that by people seeing you role modeling these behaviors, that it has a network effect essentially on the rest of the system, the rest of the people in that organization. And my favorite example of this is I coached the leadership team of a very well-known bank. Samuel L. Jackson might use them, for instance. And, we were doing this sort of, they were doing an agile transformation. And, the CEO of the company was like,
and just really quick, for anyone who's not familiar with agile transformation, what does that mean?
Oh, it's often when people are trying to create a better way of delivering products to their customers, right? Changing the way that they build and release software, working in smaller iterations and so forth. They had the concept of agile everywhere was the name of their initiative. Okay. They wanted their business to be more agile, more adaptive.
Gotcha.
And, so he started going to himself, well, if we're going to ask everyone else to do this, we should start working in that way. So we started working in that way. And what he realized is, and that, one of the things in Agile is you do this a retrospective at the end of an iteration, so for 1 or 2 weeks. So we did it for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks of working together, we did this retrospective where we reflect on the things that we've done for the week. And, often you get people together, they write on Post-it notes, they stick it up on the wall. So he goes off and he writes this Post-it note down. He sticks it up in the wall. And sort of shock in the room. Everyone's like, oh. and they're like, the Post-it note said, agile is hard. And everyone was like, what do you mean? He goes, well, look, I thought we were being agile. But what I realized is that we just measure output. In all our meetings, we just talk about the tasks we got done. None of us talk about the outcomes we're achieving. And if we're going to be agile, we have to talk about outcomes so we can iterate the things we try rather than just ticking off task lists. And everyone in the office was like, Jesus, wow, okay. And this is just the leadership team, right? Yeah, team of 12.
Like a very senior person.
Yeah, right. But he didn't stop there. He went back to his desk and he wrote an email and the subject title was Agile was hard. And he sent it to 50,000 people in the company.
Whoa.
And it's like, hey, everybody, I know we're going through this transformation. As part of that, we're trying to work in a different way. And what I found out from doing my first retrospective this week is that we weren't actually working in an agile way, and it's really hard.
Yeah.
So good on everybody out there. This is tough. I know it's tough. I'm encouraging people to try and keep it up, and we'll get there. Literally, people were stopping me in the corridor going, how did you get this person to write this email? And it was like, the magic was he created agency for other people. right? Like it created this ripple effect across the whole company from just one person sort of making it safe, making it vulnerable. So the way I try to say to people is you have more influence than you realize, and you have agency, but it's got to start with yourself. And if you can keep role modeling the behaviors you're looking to create, that will inspire other people because people are watching. And if you say it and live it, you'll be surprised the network effect it can have in a culture transformation. Because again, organizational transformation is just the collective impact of individual transformation.
Yeah. So I love that story. I want to push you a little bit because I'm trying to imagine what someone who's skeptical about this would say. And what comes to mind is they'd say, well, yeah, but that was like the CEO, right? So they can do whatever they want. People are going to follow. So what if someone wants to make some sort of transformation like this, right? And model it and be, the tipping point for some sort of change in their environment. And let's say they're not the CEO. They're just some person, a fairly low level employee within whatever hierarchy they work within. How does that change things? Does it change things?
Well, again, it's trying to find little ways to start small, right? And there's a very great place to start making change in your company every day. So if you're in a company, where do you spend most of your time?
Probably at your desk or in your little work area.
Okay. And if you're not there, where are you?
Let's go with meetings. I think that's the answer you wanted.
Thank you. Thank you. Great plant. Thanks for that.
No problem.
Yes, meetings, right? So, and like the reason I imagine you are so, let's say, excitable about meetings is because most of them are a massive waste of time for people.
Totally.
Right? Like they're a total waste of time.
Yeah.
So, I always say, one of the hacks I always encourage people to do is the best hack ever in a meeting is 5 minutes before it's meant to end, just stop the meeting and ask people, how effective has this meeting been? And go around the room and listen to what people have to say. And you might be surprised with some of the stuff that you hear. And you can simply say to them, well, how could we make it better next time? And go around the room again. And maybe just pick one or two of those ideas and implement them in the next meeting. And that, if anything, can have the most profound effect in a company because people start asking, why are we doing this? Is it effective? How could we do it better? And you can have more of an impact on a team because everyone who will leave that meeting and go, wow, that was a great idea to actually ask if this was a good use of our time or not. And they'll go into their next meeting and do it,
Yeah.
And so I think, this big and small, get out there and give it a go. And I look forward to hearing how people get on with it.
Perfect. Well, I know we're running short on time, but couple closing questions. First of all, where can people find you online if anyone wants to reach out, get in touch, share stories?
Sure, yeah. BarryO'Reilly.com is my website. I'm Barry O'Reilly on Twitter, LinkedIn.
All the socials.
All the socials, yeah. I always had this knack of just getting Barry O'Reilly at the right time. I think the right person tells me sign up to this before I have to be Barry O'Reilly 48.
Perfect. And any requests of the listeners? Any asks you would have of anybody listening to this?
Yes, so I love hearing from people who've maybe been inspired by our conversation, tried something new. Reach out and tell me what you've tried. Send me, a blog, a tweet, whatever you've done. I'm always curious about how people have used it in ways I've not anticipated, especially. So,
perfect.
Don't be shy.
Yeah, and we will link to Barry's new book, Unlearn, and all the other things we've mentioned in the show notes. But Barry, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing, and for just a really fun conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, it takes two, pal. So thanks very much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on iTunes. That helps us reach way more people and build this community up. For show notes, links to the resources, and everything else we discussed, please go to enliven.fm. Feel free to reach out with questions, feedback, or just to say hello by emailing connect@enliven.fm. Be sure to subscribe, and until next time, my friends, leave them better than you found them. We'll see you soon.